A struggling mechanic helped a woman with a broken truck. Then he learned her shocking secret. Have you ever met a complete stranger, but somehow they change your life forever? Imagine this: a stormy night, rain pounding against the windows, wind howling as if it wants to swallow the entire town. You're driving alone on an empty road, your gas gauge blinking red, and then bam, the engine dies in the middle of the night. No phone signal, not a soul in sight. Your heart races, panic sets in, but then, in the distance, a faint light glows from an old rundown garage. If it were you, would you dare step inside, knock on the door, and trust a total stranger? What would you do if you found out that behind that door isn't just a mechanic, but the one person who could change your fate? Comment "I'd knock" or "No way" if you'd put yourself in this situation. And don't forget to subscribe so we can dive into a story you won't be able to look away from. Now let's begin. John Thomas sat on an old worn-out chair, his rough hands gripping a coffee cup that had gone cold long ago. Outside, the town of Maple Ridge lay in darkness, the dim glow of streetlights casting faint shadows on the empty sidewalks. This wasn't the first time he had stayed up late alone in the garage, but tonight, something felt different. Rocky, his loyal dog, lay beside him, ears perked up as if hearing something beyond the thick curtain of rain. John looked up, his pale gray eyes meeting his own reflection in the glass. A hardened man, yet with eyes filled with things he would never say out loud. He was used to the silence, but was he truly okay with it? A strong gust of wind slipped through the doorframe, rustling the stack of papers on his desk. John let out a quiet sigh, pushing himself up from the chair, stretching as if to shake off the emptiness weighing on his chest. His life was simple: open the garage in the morning, work until exhaustion, then return home to Rocky. The same routine, day after day. No surprises, no changes. But something was waiting out there, something he couldn't see yet, something he wasn't prepared for. The roar of an engine echoed in the distance, sharp and jarring against the stillness of the night. John frowned. No one drove into town at this hour. Then, bam! A loud bang rang out, followed by the sharp screech of tires. John bolted toward the door, his boots splashing into the freezing puddles outside. Under the flickering streetlights, he spotted an old beat-up truck, steam rising from its hood. A figure stepped out from the driver's seat, soaked, shivering, and completely lost. Who was she? And why was she here on a night like this? John had no way of knowing that in just a few short hours, his quiet life would never be the same again. Victoria Hannah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes locked on the road ahead. The windshield wipers swiped back and forth in a futile attempt to clear the torrential downpour. Lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating the distant waters of Timberland Lake, where the surface churned violently under the storm's fury. Low fuel warning. She bit her lip, her heart hammering. This old, battered truck was nothing like what she was used to driving. It roared and rattled like a dying beast. But in the midst of running, she had no other choice. No money, no private driver, no privileges. Just her and the endless stretch of road ahead. If she was caught, she would lose everything. But if she kept running, would she have anything left? Suddenly, the engine let out a high-pitched screech. Then, bam! The truck jolted and died. The fuel gauge kept blinking red. She slammed her hand against the steering wheel, frustration flooding through her as she glanced around. Not a single soul in sight, no phone signal. Victoria pulled her soaked jacket tighter around herself before pushing the door open. A blast of freezing wind hit her face, cutting through her like shards of ice. Her leather boots sank into a puddle, mud splattering against her already tattered jeans. What was she supposed to do? Stand here and wait for a miracle, or risk stepping into the darkness? Another streak of lightning tore across the sky, and in that split second, she saw it. A small garage, its lights flickering in the distance. Victoria took a deep breath, pulled up her hood, and clenched her jaw before stepping forward. She had no idea that the door she was about to knock on would change her fate forever. John Thomas knew it the moment he saw her. A woman standing on the edge of the storm, rain-soaked hair clinging to her face, her hands clutching her jacket like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. She didn't belong to this town. So why was she here, alone, on this cold, unforgiving night? Her old battered truck sat dead in the middle of Timberland Pass, a thin stream of smoke curling from the hood. John tugged his hat down and stepped forward. Beside him, Rocky let out a low growl, his sharp eyes locked onto the stranger. Engine died? John's deep, gravelly voice cut through the howling wind. The woman blinked up at him, her brown eyes holding something unreadable. Worry, fear, or something even deeper. Yeah, she nodded slightly. I think it just took its last breath. A quiet joke in the middle of the storm. John almost smirked. But a woman like her, with that sharp voice, that proud stance, why was she driving a truck that looked like it was on its last legs? He didn't ask. Everyone had their secrets. Without another word, John stepped forward and lifted the hood. Rusted engine, leaking oil, loose belts. This thing had given up a long time ago. I'll tow it to my garage. I'll take a better look at it in the morning. She frowned. How much? John raised an eyebrow. Free. She looked at him like he had just said something absurd. In her world, nothing came for free. Why? He shrugged. Because helping someone doesn't need a reason. The rain poured harder, cutting their conversation short. Get in. He gestured toward his truck. Victoria hesitated a second longer than necessary. She wasn't used to relying on anyone. She wasn't used to kindness without conditions. But she didn't have another choice. She nodded, stepping around to the passenger side. And for the first time in her life, she wondered, had she just found a place where she truly belonged? Victoria stood in the small back room of the garage, silently taking in her surroundings. There wasn't much: a single bed with a thin blanket, an old wooden table, and a dim yellow light casting flickering shadows on the slightly cracked walls. A simple space, yet warm in a way she hadn't expected. She had stayed in the most luxurious hotels in the world, where everything was catered to her, but she had never felt this unsettled. Outside, the steady clanking of metal echoed. John was still working in the garage. She wondered, what kind of man was he really? John Thomas, a mechanic living in solitude with his loyal dog. A man who didn't hesitate to tow her truck in the middle of a storm. A man who offered help without asking for anything in return. Did kindness like that truly exist? Or was it just a mask for something else? A knock at the door broke her thoughts. John stood there holding a thick sweater, his expression calm, as if having a stranger sleep in his garage was no big deal. The room doesn't have heating. It gets cold at night. He held out the sweater. Victoria hesitated. She wasn't used to accepting help without strings attached. But his gaze was steady, expecting nothing, searching for nothing. She took the sweater. Thank you. John nodded and turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, why are you helping me? He stopped. Without turning around, his voice was as steady as the man himself. Because someone once did the same for me. Victoria frowned. That answer made her want to ask more. But before she could, John had already disappeared into the night of the garage, leaving her with 100 unanswered questions. She looked down at the sweater in her hands, then sighed, wrapping her arms around herself. This wasn't the life she knew. No skyscrapers, no million-dollar contracts, no dazzling city lights of Chicago. And yet somehow in the quiet darkness of a small garage, she felt safer than she ever had before. John watched Victoria from a distance as she fumbled with a set of tools on the table. She wanted to help, but it was obvious. She was completely out of place. What's this for? She held up a wrench, gripping it like it was the most foreign thing she had ever touched. John crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly. For tightening bolts. Victoria nodded as if she understood, but not even 5 minutes later, the wrench slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the concrete floor. It wasn't hard to see. She didn't belong here. Her hands were free of calluses. Her movements lacked the ease of someone used to manual work. Even in worn-out clothes, there was an air of wealth about her. And more than anything, she wasn't asking about how to fix a car. She was asking how to exist in this place. What was she running from? John wasn't the type to pry. Everyone had their reasons for keeping secrets. But with Victoria, the mystery wasn't in what she said. It was in what she didn't say. Hold on to this. He tossed her a screwdriver. Victoria caught it, but barely. He raised an eyebrow, half amused. You've definitely held a screwdriver before, right? She pressed her lips together before letting out a small laugh. Of course. But when she crouched down to tighten a bolt on the engine, she turned it the wrong way. John folded his arms, smirking. Let me guess. You used to work in mechanics? She sighed, placing a hand on her hip. Not exactly, but I was good at managing it. And that was the moment John realized. Victoria wasn't just some nameless traveler passing through town. She had run something before. Something much bigger than a small garage in Maple Ridge. But what had made her walk away from all of it? John didn't ask. But some part of him knew that. Sooner or later, the answer would find its way to him. John Thomas leaned over the engine of an old Ford, his hands covered in grease, his mind focused on the job. He didn't notice Joseph White step into the garage until the older man spoke. Do you know who that girl really is? John looked up, frowning at the delivery man. Joseph wasn't the type to meddle in other people's business, but there was something different in his gaze, something probing. You mean Victoria? Joseph didn't answer. Instead, he pulled out his phone, his thin fingers moving swiftly across the screen before handing it to John. An old news article appeared, a photograph of a woman standing in front of a towering skyscraper in Chicago. Dressed in a flawless suit, her long brown hair neatly pinned back, her sharp eyes belonging to someone who knew power. The bold headline read, Victoria Hanna, heir to Hanna Enterprises, disappears after father's unexpected death. John felt like he had been punched in the chest. Victoria wasn't just some nameless woman passing through Maple Ridge. She was a billionaire, a businesswoman destined to run a massive empire. And now, what was she doing? Working in a small-town garage, struggling to tighten a bolt she didn't even know how to turn the right way. The only question now was, why? John handed the phone back, his face unreadable. Why are you telling me this? Joseph's voice lowered. You're a good man, John, but you need to know the truth. If she's running from all of that, there's a reason. And if people are looking for her, he paused, his gaze sharp. Are you ready to be caught up in whatever this is? John didn't answer right away. He looked out the window where Victoria stood in the corner of the garage, wrapped in the sweater he had given her that first night. What was he supposed to do with this truth? Confront her? Stay silent? Let her decide when to tell him? But before he could make that choice, Victoria turned. And when their eyes met, John knew. She had realized he knew everything. The real storm was just beginning. Victoria stood facing John in the small back room of the garage, her breath heavy. She had known this moment would come. John didn't dance around it, didn't give her a chance to escape. His gaze was sharp, his voice steady. You're Victoria Hanna, heir to Hanna Enterprises, aren't you? The room suddenly felt suffocating. She clenched her hands into fists, her nails digging into her palms, but not enough to quiet the storm raging inside her. She could deny it. She could weave another lie. But John's eyes, the way he looked at her, made that impossible. She exhaled deeply. Yes. There was no turning back now. John remained calm, but something in his expression shifted. Not anger, not disappointment, but something that looked like quiet disbelief. Why are you here? A simple question, but the answer was anything but. Victoria let out a short, hollow laugh. Because I don't want to become someone I didn't choose to be. John didn't respond. He just waited. She turned away, resting her forehead against the cold wall. When she spoke again, her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of everything she had buried for so long. I was born into a world where everything was decided for me. I was taught how to shake the right hands, how to give orders, how to run an empire I never had the chance to refuse. When my father died, it all came crashing down on me like a boulder. No one asked if I wanted it. No one cared if I was ready. She swallowed hard before continuing. I tried. I did everything they expected of me. But one day I looked in the mirror and realized, I didn't recognize myself anymore. So I left. John slowly sat down by the table, his hands clasped together, thinking. And you thought you could run forever? Victoria closed her eyes. She wanted to say yes, but she knew that wasn't the truth. She wasn't just running from a company. She was running from an entire life. Unexpectedly, John let out a sigh. But instead of judgment, he said something that caught her completely off guard. So, what are you going to do now? She turned to him, meeting his gaze. And for the first time, she realized John wasn't here to condemn her or force her into making a decision right away. He just wanted to know what she truly wanted. For the first time in years, Victoria felt a flicker of hope. Victoria stood in front of Thomas Auto Repair, her breath mixing with the crisp morning air. The sun had just begun to rise, but inside her, a part of her was sinking into darkness. She didn't want to leave, but she knew she had to. John stood just a few steps away, his hands clenched inside his coat pockets. He didn't say anything, but his eyes said everything. The only morning bus leaving Maple Ridge was ready to depart. Victoria tightened her grip on the strap of her bag, her palms freezing. She had walked into rooms filled with the most powerful people in the world without flinching, but now, just stepping onto that bus made her chest ache. Are you sure? John's voice was steady, but there was weight behind it. Victoria bit her lip, forcing herself to stay composed. She couldn't let herself waver. She loved this place. She loved the quiet days in the garage, the small-town conversations at Willow's Diner, the way no one looked at her as a businesswoman, just Victoria. But most of all, she loved John. But could love change the truth? She took a deep breath. I have to go back. There are things I need to finish. John nodded slowly, as if he had already known the answer, but his eyes never let her go. And do you think you'll come back? Victoria froze. Would she? Or once she stepped onto that bus, would she be pulled back into the world she had once tried to escape? She didn't know. The bus engine rumbled. The driver looked at her. You getting on or not? Victoria swallowed hard. She turned to John, her eyes filled with everything she couldn't say. Would he stop her? But John wasn't that kind of man. Instead, he stepped forward, gently pulling up the hood of her coat and whispered, Whatever you choose, I'll still be here. She wanted to cry, but instead she smiled, a smile more heartbreaking than any tears. The doors closed. The bus pulled away from Maple Ridge, and in the rearview mirror, Victoria saw John standing there, alone but never turning away. She didn't know if she would come back, but a part of her hoped that if she did, he would still be there. John Thomas sat in his usual corner of the garage, the thin piece of paper in his hands trembling slightly with each breath. Victoria's letter. John, by the time you read this, I will be gone, not because I wanted to leave, but because I knew I couldn't keep running forever. But there's something I need you to know. My time in Maple Ridge was the happiest I've ever been. Not the lavish parties or the grand boardrooms, but the laughter in the garage, the way Rocky slept at my feet, the late afternoons when you taught me the difference between a wrench and a screwdriver. I came here to escape, but I never expected this place to make me feel like I belonged. And you were the biggest reason for that. But I can't let you be the one holding me here. I need to go back, not to return to my old life, but to find out if I can write a new story for myself. If one day I come back, will you still be here? Victoria. John clenched the letter in his hands. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but this loss cut deeper than anything he had ever known. Maple Ridge hadn't changed, but without her, it felt emptier than ever. She was still here, in the little traces of her presence that he couldn't ignore. Her old sweater, neatly folded on the chair. The coffee mug she always used, now cold and untouched. The screwdriver she had held the wrong way, still sitting on the table, as if waiting for her to come back and fix her mistake. But would she? John didn't know. He leaned back, closing his eyes. Could he go back to life as it was? He had once been content with solitude, but now the silence surrounding him didn't bring peace. It only brought a hollow emptiness he couldn't ignore. Maybe it was time for him to be the one to move first. The letter remained on the table as John stood up. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in a long time, He knew he stay still. Chicago glowed under the city lights, skyscrapers towering high, streets bustling with cars and endless movement. This was her world. This was where she belonged, wasn't it? Victoria sat in her office at Hannah Enterprises, a cup of coffee long gone cold beside her. Her eyes were fixed on the computer screen, but her mind was somewhere else. A small town, an old garage, and a man whose eyes made her feel safer than any steel walls the city could offer. Your meeting starts at 10. The board wants to hear your plan. Her assistant's voice was a distant echo. Did she really want this? She had once dreamed of this position, believed that if she took control, she could change everything. She could finally have control over her own life. But now she felt like an actor in a play she no longer wanted to star in. Then something on her screen caught her eye. A small article. Local Maple Ridge Garage receives funding from Small Business Support Program. Her heartbeat quickened as she clicked the link. A familiar image loaded. A picture of John's garage. He had moved on. She scanned the article. The program would provide funding to businesses like John's, giving him access to better equipment, more resources, and the means to keep going. She should feel happy. So why did her chest tighten instead? John didn't need her. He never had. He had lived on his own long before she stumbled into his world, and now he was still standing without her. But was she okay without him? Victoria turned to the window. The Chicago skyline stretched endlessly before her. Yet for some reason, it no longer felt like home. She had left to find freedom, but now she realized freedom wasn't a place. It was a person. She blinked, taking a deep breath. She couldn't pretend anymore. The question was no longer whether she should go back. It was John still waiting for her? Victoria stepped into the boardroom, the sharp click of her heels echoing against the polished wood floor. This was the world she grew up in, a world where everything was calculated, where every decision carried a multi-million-dollar price tag. But today, she no longer felt like she belonged here. "Shall we begin?" A voice cut through her thoughts. All eyes turned to her. The most powerful men and women of Hannah Enterprises, the people who had always expected her to take over the empire, just as her father had. Victoria clenched her hands, then slowly released them. She didn't have to pretend anymore. "I'm resigning." A moment of dead silence. Then, "What?" Chairs scraped against the floor. A few people cleared their throats in discomfort. One of the oldest shareholders, a silver-haired man who had been one of her father's closest advisors, leaned forward. "Victoria, I don't think you understand what you're saying." She smiled faintly, but there was no hesitation in her eyes. She understood. She had never been clearer about anything in her life. "I understand perfectly." She placed her hands on the table, looking each of them in the eye. Once, she would have felt intimidated, but not today. She had spent her entire life trying to please them, trying to become the version of herself they expected. But as she stood before them, all she could think about was a small-town garage, a man with deep, steady eyes, and the days when, for the first time in her life, she had truly been herself. "I've spent my whole life following plans I never chose, but I can't do it anymore. I don't want to be the CEO of Hannah Enterprises. I don't want to live a life where I don't feel free." Silence, faces frozen in shock. They didn't understand, because they had never been trapped in their own lives. Someone scoffed. "And what exactly do you think you'll do, Victoria? Throw it all away to run off to some no-name town?" She smirked. They had no idea that she had already been there, that she had found something more valuable than any empire. "I'm not running away. I'm simply choosing a different path." She stood up, adjusting her coat. She didn't need to convince them. She didn't owe them an explanation. She turned and walked out of the room she had once believed was her entire world. She didn't know exactly where she was going, but this time she knew she was going home. John Thomas sat at his desk, Victoria's letter lying in front of him, each word etched into his mind. "If one day I come back, will you still be here?" He couldn't let that question hang in the air forever. Outside, the first winter winds howled through Maple Ridge, making the garage tremble slightly. John stood up, looking around the familiar space, a place that no longer felt like home. Not without her. He knew what he had to do. Without hesitation, John walked to the Thomas Auto Repair sign and flipped it to closed before heading to his truck. For the first time in years, he locked the garage doors without knowing when he'd reopen them. But this time, he wasn't fixing something. He was fighting to keep it. The journey to Chicago wasn't easy. The quiet roads of Maple Ridge disappeared behind him, replaced by endless highways stretching toward the horizon. As the towering skyline of Chicago came into view, its bright lights stood in stark contrast to the empty streets of his small town. John wasn't used to skyscrapers. He wasn't used to blaring horns, to crowds rushing past without a second glance. Was he being a fool? He had no idea if Victoria was even here, no idea what he would say when he saw her. But there was one thing he knew for sure. He couldn't let her walk out of his life without a fight. John pulled up in front of Hannah Enterprises, a gleaming glass and steel tower in the heart of the city. He took a deep breath. This was her world, not his. But he didn't care. Stepping inside the grand lobby, he watched as business professionals hurried past him, their expensive suits and polished shoes a stark contrast to his flannel shirt and dust-covered boots. The receptionist looked up, eyeing him from head to toe, a man who didn't belong in this world. "I need to see Victoria Hannah." The receptionist frowned. "Do you have an appointment?" John smirked. "Number, but tell her. The mechanic from Maple Ridge is standing right here." Then he folded his arms and stood his ground. If she truly wanted to leave everything behind, she could refuse to see him. But if there was even a part of her that still cared, she would show up, and he would wait, no matter how long it took. Victoria stepped out of the boardroom, her mind still spinning from the weight of her decisions. She had resigned. She had walked away from everything. And yet, for some reason, she couldn't bring herself to leave this building. Then, his name rang out. "John Thomas is in the main lobby." She froze. Number it couldn't be. He came here? Her feet moved before her mind could catch up. She ran. Descending the staircase, she reached the ground floor. And the sight before her stole the breath from her lungs. A man, dressed in a worn-out flannel, grease-stained jeans, standing in the middle of the opulent Hannah Enterprises lobby. John. She couldn't move, couldn't think. How had he come here, and why? The answer came seconds later. John took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering as he faced the powerful figures surrounding him. "I don't care who she is," a murmur rippled through the crowd, but John stood his ground. "I don't care if she's the heir to Hannah Enterprises or just the woman who once messed up every tool in my garage." Victoria's heartbeat thundered in her chest. "I just need to know, is she happy?" A silence so deep it swallowed the entire room. Victoria didn't hesitate. She ran. She pushed through the stunned onlookers, ignoring their curious stares and whispered speculation. John had just turned when she crashed into him, her arms wrapping tightly around him. He had come for her. He didn't care who she was, only if she was happy. And now she knew her answer. Holding on to him, her voice trembled against his chest. "No, not without you." John let out a breath, his arms tightening around her, holding her like he never planned to let go. The most powerful people in Hannah Enterprises stood around them, speechless. Because in that moment, nothing else existed but the two of them. Victoria rested her head against the truck's window, watching as Chicago's towering skyline faded into the distance in the rearview mirror. This time she wasn't leaving to run away. She was leaving to come home. John kept his eyes on the road, hands gripping the wheel just a little too tightly, as if he still couldn't quite believe she was really here, sitting beside him. "Are you sure?" She turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "How many times are you going to ask me that?" John exhaled, shaking his head. He wasn't the kind of man who easily believed in good things. But as he glanced at Victoria, the woman who had walked away from an empire just to return to a small town with him, he realized that some things were worth believing in. When they arrived in Maple Ridge, the sky was painted in shades of fiery orange. Everything was the same: the quiet streets, the roadside diner, and John's garage standing just as it always had at the edge of town. But this time, there was something new. A small sign stood next to the garage, "The Cozy Corner, coming soon." John raised an eyebrow. "You're serious about this?" Victoria grinned, her eyes gleaming. What do you think? I've spent my whole life running skyscrapers, managing numbers I never cared about. Now I just want to create a place where people can stop, have coffee, and actually live. John stared at her for a long moment before finally, he smiled. A real smile. She hadn't just come back to him. She was building something new, right beside him. They stepped into the old cafe space that Victoria had just leased. It was empty inside, with worn wooden floors and faded walls. But through her eyes, John could already see it as something alive, something full of possibility. "You're really staying?" he asked, like he still wasn't sure this was real. Victoria turned to face him, stepping closer. She wrapped her arms around him and held him tight. "I'm not going anywhere." Outside, Maple Ridge welcomed her home, and this time she knew. She truly was home. Victoria stood in front of Thomas Auto Repair, taking a deep breath. No more doubt, no more questions about whether she belonged here. She already knew the answer. John stepped out of the garage, something small and silver glinting in his hand under the golden hues of the setting sun. "Do you remember the first time you came here?" She laughed softly, warmth filling her eyes. "How could I forget? You thought I couldn't tell the difference between a wrench and a screwdriver." John smirked, but this time, there was no hesitation in his gaze, only certainty. He took her hand and placed the old silver key in her palm. "This is yours." Victoria blinked, her fingers tightening around the key. "This is—" John exhaled, then smiled. "I used to think this garage only belonged to me. But since you came, I've realized it was never just mine. It belongs to the people who need a place to stop, to those looking for somewhere to belong. And you've always had a place here." She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected a grand confession, but in John's way, this was exactly that. A quiet, undeniable acknowledgement that she was an irreplaceable part of his life. Victoria smiled, emotion swelling in her chest. She had once held skyscrapers in the palm of her hand, signed million-dollar contracts, but somehow this tiny key meant more than anything she had ever owned. "So, does this mean I can come into the garage anytime?" she teased. John raised an eyebrow. "Number, it's to remind you that you don't have to leave. No more running, no more feeling lost." Victoria nodded, stepping forward and wrapping her arms around him. They didn't need any more words. Just this moment, just the steady rhythm of two hearts finally beating in sync. Outside, Maple Ridge remained the same. Peaceful, simple. But this time, it wasn't just a small town. It was home. And you? Have you ever found home in a way like this? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more heartfelt stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Life lesson from this story. We don't find happiness, we create it. Life is an ever-changing journey. We spend most of our time chasing what's considered right. A stable career, a respected reputation, a life that others admire. But sometimes in the pursuit of ambition and expectations, we lose ourselves. Victoria Hannah's story is proof of that. She had everything anyone would dream of: money, power, status. But despite having it all, she felt empty, because she never truly had a choice. Lesson number 1. Life isn't about achieving the most. It's about being true to yourself. Victoria spent her entire youth trying to meet other people's expectations, molding herself into the person they wanted her to be. But when she looked in the mirror, she no longer recognized herself. That's when she realized happiness doesn't come from pleasing others. It comes from the courage to live authentically. John Thomas was the same. He was a simple man, uninterested in the world beyond Maple Ridge. He didn't chase luxury, he didn't seek validation. Yet even with his quiet life, he wasn't truly happy until he met Victoria. Lesson number 2. Happiness isn't about where you are. It's about who you're with. Both Victoria and John thought they were fine on their own, but when they found each other, they realized that life is fuller when you have someone to share it with. Someone to go through the ordinary days, to share small joys, to know that no matter what happens, someone is waiting for you. Ultimately, this story isn't just about love. It's about choices. Lesson number 3, happiness doesn't just happen. We must choose it. Victoria could have chosen to stay in Chicago, continuing the life she always knew. John could have chosen to stay in Maple Ridge, never stepping out of his comfort zone. But they chose to fight for each other. They chose to step beyond the familiar to chase what truly mattered. And that is the greatest lesson of all. Happiness isn't a destination. It's a journey. We don't just find happiness. We must dare to claim it, fight for it, and cherish every moment it brings. Have you ever faced a crossroad in life where you had to choose between safety and what your heart truly wanted? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to subscribe.